Chapter 7 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Forsyte Saga, The Man of Property, by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 7, Old Jolyon's Peccadillo. Old Jolyon came out of Lord's cricket ground that same afternoon with the intention of going home. He had not reached Hamilton Terrace before he changed his mind, and hailing a cab, gave the driver an address in Wistaria Avenue. He had taken a resolution. June had hardly been at home at all that week. She had given him nothing of her company for a long time past, not, in fact, since she had become engaged to Bosinney. He never asked her for her company. It was not his habit to ask people for things. She had just that one idea now, Bosinney and his affairs, and she left him stranded in his great house with a parcel of servants, and not a soul to speak to from morning to night. His club was closed for cleaning, his boards in recess. There was nothing, therefore, to take him into the city. June had wanted him to go away. She would not go herself, because Bosinney was in London. But where was he to go by himself? He could not go abroad alone. The sea upset his liver. He hated hotels. Roger went to a hydropathic. He was not going to begin that at his time of life. Those newfangled places were all humbug. With such formulas he clothed to himself the desolation of his spirit, the lines down his face deepening, his eyes day by day looking forth with the melancholy which sat so strangely on a face wont to be strong and serene. And so that afternoon he took his journey through St. John's Wood, in the golden light that sprinkled the round green bushes of the acacias before the little houses, in the summer sunshine that seemed holding a revel over the little gardens, and he looked about him with interest, for this was a district which no Forsyte entered without open disapproval and secret curiosity. His cab stopped in front of a small house of that peculiar buff colour which implies a long immunity from paint. It had an outer gate and a rustic approach. He stepped out, his bearing extremely composed, his massive head with its drooping moustache and wings of white hair very upright under an excessively large top hat, his glance firm, a little angry. He had been driven into this. "Mrs. Jolyon Forsyte at home?" "Oh, yes, sir. What name shall I say, if you please, sir?" Old Jolyon could not help twinkling at the little maid as he gave his name. She seemed to him such a funny little toad. And he followed her through the dark hall into a small double drawing-room, where the furniture was covered in chintz, and the little maid placed him in a chair. "They're all in the garden, sir. If you'll kindly take a seat, I'll tell them." Old Jolyon sat down in the chintz-covered chair and looked around him. The whole place seemed to him, as he would have expressed it, poky. There was a certain, he could not tell exactly what, air of shabbiness, or rather of making two ends meet, about everything. As far as he could see, not a single piece of furniture was worth a 5-pound note. The walls, distempered rather a long time ago, were decorated with water-colour sketches. Across the ceiling meandered a long crack. These little houses were all old, second-rate concerns. He should hope the rent was under 100 a year. It hurt him more than he could have said to think of a Forsyte, his own son, living in such a place. The little maid came back. Would he please to go down into the garden? Old Jolyon marched out through the French windows. In descending the steps he noticed that they wanted painting. Young Jolyon, his wife, his 2 children, and his dog Balthasar were all out there under a pear tree. This walk towards them was the most courageous act of old Jolyon's life, but no muscle of his face moved, no nervous gesture betrayed him. He kept his deep-set eyes steadily on the enemy. In those 2 minutes he demonstrated to perfection all that unconscious soundness, balance, and vitality of fibre that made of him and so many others of his class the core of the nation. In the unostentatious conduct of their own affairs, to the neglect of everything else, they typified the essential individualism born in the Briton from the natural isolation of his country's life. The dog Balthasar sniffed round the edges of his trousers. This friendly and cynical mongrel, offspring of a liaison between a Russian poodle and a fox terrier, had a nose for the unusual. The strange greetings over, old Jolyon seated himself in a wicker chair, and his 2 grandchildren, one on each side of his knees, looked at him silently, never having seen so old a man. They were unlike, as though recognizing the difference set between them by the circumstances of their births. Jolly, the child of sin, pudgy-faced, with his tow-coloured hair brushed off his forehead, and a dimple in his chin, had an air of stubborn amiability, and the eyes of a Forsyte. Little Holly, the child of wedlock, was a dark-skinned, solemn soul, with her mother's grey and wistful eyes. The dog Balthazar, having walked round the 3 small flower-beds, to show his extreme contempt for things at large, had also taken a seat in front of old Jolyon, and, oscillating a tail curled by nature tightly over his back, was staring up with eyes that did not blink. Even in the garden, that sense of things being poky haunted old Jolyon. The wicker chair creaked under his weight, the garden beds looked daverdy, on the far side, under the smut-stained wall, cats had made a path. While he and his grandchildren thus regarded each other with the peculiar scrutiny, curious yet trustful, that passes between the very young and the very old, young Jolyon watched his wife. The colour had deepened in her thin oval face, with its straight brows and large grey eyes. Her hair, brushed in fine high curves back from her forehead, was going grey, like his own, and this greyness made the sudden vivid colour in her cheeks painfully pathetic. The look on her face, such as he had never seen there before, such as she had always hidden from him, was full of secret resentments and longings and fears. Her eyes, under their twitching brows, stared painfully, and she was silent. Jolly alone sustained the conversation. He had many possessions, and was anxious that his unknown friend, with extremely large moustaches and hands all covered with blue veins, who sat with legs crossed like his own father, a habit he was himself trying to acquire, should know it. But being a Forsyte, though not yet quite 8 years old, he made no mention of the thing at the moment dearest to his heart, a camp of soldiers and a shop window, which his father had promised to buy. No doubt it seemed to him too precious, a tempting of Providence, to mention it yet. And the sunlight played through the leaves on that little party of the 3 generations grouped tranquilly under the pear-tree, which had long borne no fruit. Old Jolyon's furrowed face was reddening patchily, as old men's faces redden in the sun. He took one of Jolly's hands in his own. The boy climbed onto his knee, and little Holly, mesmerized by this sight, crept up to them. The sound of the dog Balthazar's scratching arose rhythmically. Suddenly young Mrs. Jolyon got up and hurried indoors. A minute later her husband muttered an excuse and followed. Old Jolyon was left alone with his grandchildren. And Nature, with her quaint irony, began working in him one of her strange revolutions, following her cyclic laws into the depths of his heart, and that tenderness for little children, that passion for the beginnings of life which had once made him forsake his sun and follow June, now worked in him to forsake June and follow these littler things. Youth, like a flame, burned ever in his breast, and to youth he turned, to the round little limbs so reckless that wanted care, to the small round faces so unreasonably solemn or bright, to the treble tongues and the shrill chuckling laughter, to the insistent tugging hands and the feel of small bodies against his legs, to all that was young and once more young. And his eyes grew soft, his voice and thin veined hands soft, and soft his heart within him. And to those small creatures he became at once a place of pleasure, a place where they were secure and could talk and laugh and play, till like sunshine there radiated from old Jolyon's wicker chair the perfect gaiety of 3 hearts. But with young Jolyon following to his wife's room it was different. He found her seated on a chair before her dressing-glass, with her hands before her face. Her shoulders were shaking with sobs. This passion of hers for suffering was mysterious to him. He had been through 100 of these moods. How he had survived them he never knew, for he could never believe they were moods, and that the last hour of his partnership had not struck. In the night she would be sure to throw her arms round his neck and say, "Oh, Joe, how I make you suffer," as she had done 100 times before. He reached out his hand, and unseen slipped his razor-case into his pocket. "I cannot stay here," he thought. "I must go down." Without a word he left the room and went back to the lawn. Old Jolyon had little Holly on his knee. She had taken possession of his watch. Jolly, very red in the face, was trying to show that he could stand on his head. The dog Balthazar, as close as he might be to the tea-table, has fixed his eyes on the cake. Young Jolyon felt a malicious desire to cut their enjoyment short. What business had his father to come and upset his wife like this? It was a shock after all these years. He ought to have known. He ought to have given them warning. But when did a Forsyte ever imagine that his conduct could upset anybody? And in his thoughts he did old Jolyon wrong. He spoke sharply to the children and told them to go in to their tea. Greatly surprised, for they had never heard their father speak sharply before, they went off, hand in hand, little Holly looking back over her shoulder. Young Jolyon poured out the tea. "My wife's not the thing to-day," he said, but he knew well enough that his father had penetrated the cause of that sudden withdrawal, and almost hated the old man for sitting there so calmly. "You've got a nice little house here," said old Jolyon with a shrewd look. "I suppose you've taken a lease of it?" Young Jolyon nodded. "I don't like the neighbourhood," said old Jolyon. "A ramshackle lot." Young Jolyon replied, "Yes, we're a ramshackle lot." The silence was now only broken by the sound of the dog Balthazar's scratching. Old Jolyon said simply, "I suppose I oughtn't to have come here, Joe, but I get so lonely." At these words young Jolyon got up and put his hand on his father's shoulder. In the next house someone was playing over and over again "La Donna Mobile" on an untuned piano, and the little garden had fallen into shade. The sun now only reached the wall at the end, whereon basked a crouching cat, her yellow eyes turned sleepily down on the dog Balthazar. There was a drowsy hum of very distant traffic. The creepered trellis round the garden shut out everything but sky and house and pear tree, with its top branches still gilded by the sun. For some time they sat there, talking but little. Then old Jolyon rose to go, and not a word was said about his coming again. He walked away very sadly. What a poor, miserable place, and he thought of the great empty house in Stanhope Gate, fit residence for a Forsyte, with its huge billiard-room and drawing-room that no one entered from one week's end to another. That woman, whose face he had rather liked, was too thin-skinned by half, she gave Joe a bad time he knew, and those sweet children, ah, what a piece of awful folly! He walked towards the Edgware Road, between rows of little houses, all suggesting to him, erroneously no doubt, but the prejudices of a Forsyte are sacred, shady histories of some sort or kind. Society, forsooth, the chattering hags and jackanapes, had set themselves up to pass judgment on his flesh and blood, a parcel of old women. He stumped his umbrella on the ground, as though to drive it into the heart of that unfortunate body which had dared to ostracize his son and his son's son, and whom he could have lived again. He stumped his umbrella fiercely, yet he himself had followed society's behaviour for 15 years, had only to-day been false to it. He thought of June and her dead mother, and the whole story, with all his old bitterness. A wretched business. He was a long time reaching Stanhope Gate, for with native perversity, being extremely tired, he walked the whole way. After washing his hands in the lavatory downstairs, he went to the dining-room to wait for dinner, the only room he used when June was out. It was less lonely so. The evening paper had not yet come. He had finished the Times. There was therefore nothing to do. The room faced the backwater of traffic, and was very silent. He disliked dogs, but a dog even would have been company. His gaze, travelling around the walls, rested on a picture entitled "Group of Dutch Fishing Boats at Sunset," the chef d'oeuvre of his collection. It gave him no pleasure. He closed his eyes. He was lonely. He oughtn't to complain, he knew, but he couldn't help it. He was a poor thing, had always been a poor thing, no pluck. Such was his thought. The butler came to lay the table for dinner, and seeing his master apparently asleep, exercised extreme caution in his movements. This bearded man also wore a moustache, which had given rise to grave doubts in the minds of many members of the family, especially those who, like Soames, had been to public schools and were accustomed to niceness in such matters. Could he really be considered a butler? Playful spirits alluded to him as Uncle Jolyon's nonconformist. George, the acknowledged wag, had named him Sankey. He moved to and fro between the great polished sideboard and the great polished table, inimitably sleek and soft. Old Jolyon watched him, feigning sleep. The fellow was a sneak, he had always thought so, who cared about nothing but rattling through his work, and getting out to his bedding, or his woman, or goodness knew what. A slug, fat too, and didn't care a pin about his master. But then, against his will, came one of those moments of philosophy which made old Jolyon different from other Forsytes. After all, why should the man care? He wasn't paid to care, and why expect it? In this world people couldn't look for affection unless they paid for it. It might be different in the next, he didn't know, couldn't tell, and again he shut his eyes. Relentless and stealthy, the butler pursued his labours, taking things from the various compartments on the sideboard. His back seemed always turned to old Jolyon, thus he robbed his operations of the unseemliness of being carried on in his master's presence. Now and then he furtively breathed on the silver, and wiped it with a piece of chamois leather. He appeared to pore over the quantities of wine in the decanters, which he carried carefully and rather high, letting his head droop over them protectingly. When he had finished, he stood for over a minute watching his master, and in his greenish eyes there was a look of contempt. After all, this master of his was an old buffer, who hadn't much left in him. Soft as a tomcat he crossed the room to press the bell. His orders were "dinner at 7." What if his master were asleep? He would soon have him out of that; there was the night to sleep in. He had himself to think of, for he was due at his club at 8:30. In answer to the ring appeared a page boy with a silver soup tureen. The butler took it from his hands and placed it on the table; then, standing by the open door, as though about to usher company into the room, he said in a solemn voice: "Dinner is on the table, sir." Slowly old Jolyon got up out of his chair and sat down at the table to eat his dinner. Part 1, Chapter 7. Recording by Leanne Howlett.